Welcome back to Hilaal Live. Joe, I'd like to come back to you. Ever since, of course, October the 7th, there have been many UN resolutions brought forward in order to have the ceasefire in Gaza. And, of course, we've been using the word ceasefire quite loosely, but it's not just a loose word. It's an imperative word. It's a word that needs an action that needs to be done. And unfortunately, it has disappointingly failed. And of course, that's down to the United States exercising their veto powers within the UN Security Council. Now, of course, heard an international law expert, Francis Doyle, of course, who interviewed on an American channel, saying that this does, to a certain extent, give a strength to the case that, look, there have been UN resolutions from the General Assembly to have the ceasefire brought forward, and unfortunately, it has not happened. Is there a potential positive in this, in that when this presentation is being given to the ICJ, they can say, listen, we've tried to bring a ceasefire, but unfortunately, those who have the veto powers are totally and squarely against it?
So I think what you're raising is an absolute travesty that we have come to month 4 of this genocide, and that global powers have attempted to stymie not even an end to a genocide, but a moment for people to bury their dead. So I think that you are raising that, and I think that is a deep complicity on the part of what we understand as a Western-dominated international community. And I think you're absolutely right, because I think one of the points that is very clear here is that one shouldn't underestimate whether or not states undertake their obligations emanating from rulings from the ICJ. It is a massive, massive symbolic and legal moment. And so, absolutely, I think the fact that there has been an absolute failure by states to exercise diplomatic means and political means to bring about at least a pause, at least an end to genocide, at least a ceasefire, does lend some credence to this case. And also, given that there are interim measures being sought, I mean, a ceasefire could be seen as an interim measure. Many who speak of ceasefire in real terms speak of a ceasefire, but a ceasefire within the context of an end to genocide and a complete end to, the Zionist occupation of Palestine. So I think what we're seeing here is a failure of many mechanisms within the United Nations system, and thus a resorting to the judicial organ of the United Nations in the shape of the ICJ. And I think, on the one hand, I think you're right. And I think also adding to this, one of the increasing levels of propaganda that we're seeing is, Israel saying, but we're letting in more humanitarian aid, for example. So kind of using humanitarian aid as a fig leaf to continue genocide. Now, that is not to say that humanitarian aid should not be going in. Of course it should. But we also need an end to this genocide. So I think you're absolutely right that this is really, it's a shame and a travesty that we've come to this. And it's a failure on the part of so many who have done so little and so much to continue this genocide.
Roshan, in the court of public opinion, I think all three of us can agree that the people of Gaza and Palestine are winners. But obviously, in the court of law, it's a completely different perspective altogether. But what we have seen, and of course, through your work with PDS, and not just in South Africa, but across the globe, the continuing voices that are starting to come from Hollywood to the music industry, to various walks of life, even sports, where so many of these individuals are calling for the liberation of Palestine, calling for a ceasefire, and really calling for there to be an accountability from Israel. How much of that, and I know it's asking for a lot, but how much of that could potentially sway in the favor of those judges sitting in the ICJ to take it from a human perspective and say, look, there is a huge public outcry, and maybe, just maybe, this could change the tide.
Yes, I think the public outcry is absolutely essential. I think we probably wouldn't have got to this point had there not been such a sort of mushrooming and explosion of voices who were no longer, scared, no longer silenced by accusations of weaponized anti-Semitism. I mean, if you look at the 3 million people that came out on a demonstration in London, that was totally unprecedented for Palestine, calling for a ceasefire. I think those sorts of things work. They put pressure on governments. I mean, when we were calling on the international community, we were calling on, at the time, some of the most right-wing governments. We were calling on Thatcher's Britain, on Reagan's America. Now, again, we're dealing with incredibly right-wing governments around the world. But to have 3 million people on the streets of London on an issue that actually had brought down the possibility of having a Labour government a few years back with these weaponized accusations of anti-Semitism, I think is something quite remarkable. And that's what we need to keep up. It does have an impact. It can't fail not to. I think also in South Africa, we've seen musicians and artists coming out. We've seen healthcare workers. We'll hopefully see more and more journalists coming out in support of their colleagues who are being targeted and assassinated. But we've seen people across the board expressing support in a way that's never been seen before. And we need to keep building on that and keep mobilizing. And on that point, there's a Global Day of Action this Saturday. And I think it's vital that people in South Africa come out, both in support of what our government's doing in the ICJ, but also to put pressure on other arms of government and other institutions in our country that are falling way behind. In Joburg, it's going to be a picket at the US consulate starting at 11 a.m. and in Cape Town at the Mandela Glasses on the Sea Point Promenade. Yes. I think there are also actions taking place in Durban, in other parts of the country. I saw something happening in, I think, East London, but we'll try to keep updating people on the social medias and everything with what's happening around the country. But let's come out in numbers. Let's come out in support of our government multilaterally. And let's put pressure on our government, because we still have the cases pending in the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority, around the South Africans that have already been charged with violating the Foreign Military Assistance Act. And there are many more now also, I'm sure, being brought as evidence is being gathered of South Africans going to fight for the occupation forces now as they commit a genocide. So we need to keep pressure on them. DIRCO has issued a statement warning people not to do this, but we still haven't seen the MPA move towards any prosecutions. We need to pressure our sports minister to come out and make some kind of public statement that they are going to make policy around a sports boycott. We can't carry on with this playing sport as normal, with cultural activities as normal with a genocidal country. And so we need to still put pressure on some parts of our government to catch up, to get on board, to show their support, in effect, with the other side of our government that is taking this really incredible, bold and important move. So, yeah, I think the public opinion, challenging the narrative, allowing people, having activities where people feel they can do something and not despair, because it's hard when you watch a genocide unfolding, which also has never happened before, that you feel you want to do something and what can you do? And I think we really need to keep up all these activities. They might feel small, but if you look across the world, everyone across the world doing these small activities mounts up to a global pressure, as you say. And I think that does put pressure on decision makers, definitely.
Rashan, before we go to the break, the United States and the United Kingdom, of course, are two countries that are as strong with Israel as anyone else on the globe. And of course, one could say there's a complicity in what is happening currently in Gaza. I'm sure as you did, I did, Joe also, have seen the public outcry against their respective leaders, in the US against Joe Biden, and of course in the United Kingdom against Rishi Sunak. These two supposed superpowers, as they'd like to call themselves, got egg on their face, don't they? They really are quite embarrassed at this moment that, listen, we could be supporting a country that could potentially face these genocide charges.
Yes, I think they're definitely under pressure. I mean, the ridiculous comments that were made by the American State Department, what did they say? Our case was meritless, counterproductive, and without basis in fact. I mean, I don't think that that person had even read the document, because it would be impossible to make those comments. You should be able to make a better criticism if you have one, if there is one, than to criticize it on the basis of being meritless, counterproductive, and without basis in fact, given the way that the document's been put together, as Joe was saying. In the UK, again, I mean, if you look at the case that they are trying to make against Russia for genocide, they're really getting egg on their face, because exactly the same, they're trying to make the argument around some of the very clear things that Israel is doing in Gaza, but they're failing to do so. In fact, they're trying to make a case using exactly the same argument. So if they don't support the South African case against Israel, then I think they really look totally ridiculous, and it may well impact upon their case, trying to claim genocide in another situation. So definitely. Also, of course, yes, the public opinion. I mean, it's been amazing, particularly in America, to see how the Jewish Voice for Peace has mobilized thousands of American Jews, taking over stations and the statues of liberty and all sorts of things, saying, "Not in my name." As Jews, we're not, we don't support Israel, and, coming out on the streets and saying so. And I understand that there's even over 600 now Israelis who've signed on to a petition of support for South Africa's case in the ICJ. So I think that definitely these so-called superpowers are feeling the heat. They are being challenged. I mean, they are powerful, they have the money and the weapons, but they certainly don't have the morality. They certainly don't have the public opinion on their side anymore in the way that they would like to and possibly need to if they want to continue in power. So I think we have to keep the pressure on them by here keeping the support going for our government in the ICJ, the pressure on other institutions. Our universities, for instance, are way behind. Some of the statements they have made, have any of them made a statement of support for South Africa's case? I don't think so. They should be the very first ones. They are growing the international lawyers. They're growing the experts of the future. So I think we still have to keep the pressure on here domestically and globally, all of us together, putting that pressure on the so-called superpowers when they are in a position where the hypocrisy is being revealed and the masks are being, thrown off.
Roshan has put it there. Well said. All the money, but none of the morality. After the break, we wrap up the conversation with Joe Bloon and Roshan Dadu. Do stay tuned.